AES, they answered. Why Ibrahim Traoré backed a move few expected. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. What happens when African governments stop pretending that unequal treatment is just the way things are? What happens when a decision meant to punish is answered, not with silence, not with explanations, but with action? At the end of 2025, a move from Washington quietly placed Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger on a list that shut their citizens out of the United States. For years, decisions like this passed with little response from African capitals. This time was different. Within days, the governments of the Alliance of Sahel states, under the political gravity of Ibrahim Traoré, responded with a doctrine many thought African leaders would never dare to apply consistently: reciprocity. This was not a protest. It was not a complaint. It was a signal that the rules were changing. Tonight, we're going to unpack why this moment matters, why it startled so many observers, and why it may mark a deeper shift in how sovereignty is practiced in Africa. Stay with me. Visa restrictions have long been one of the quietest tools of global hierarchy. They rarely dominate headlines, but they shape movement, opportunity, and perception. For decades, African countries absorbed these restrictions as routine, often explained away as security concerns, administrative decisions, or domestic politics in Western capitals. What made the end of 2025 different was not the restriction itself. It was the response. When the United States announced broad visa bans affecting Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the assumption was familiar. African governments would issue statements of regret, call for dialogue, and move on. That assumption was wrong. Instead, the governments of Mali and Burkina Faso publicly invoked the principle of reciprocity, the idea that sovereign states deserve equal treatment. If Malian or Burkina citizens were restricted, then U.S. nationals would face equivalent conditions. Niger went even further, acting immediately. This may sound procedural, but politically it was disruptive. Why? Because it broke a long-standing psychological pattern. For years, restrictions flowed in one direction. Access to Africa was rarely questioned, even when access for Africans was curtailed. That imbalance became normalized, not because it was fair, but because it went unchallenged. Under the emerging posture of the AES, that normalization is being rejected. This is not the first time reciprocity has appeared in Africa, but it is one of the first times it has been applied consistently and without apology. And consistency is what gives reciprocity power. We saw an early preview of this dynamic months earlier when Mali responded to a U.S. visa bond requirement with a matching financial condition. The result was immediate. The original restriction was reversed, not because of speeches, but because cost was introduced into the equation. Power responds to consequence, not to complaint. This is the core lesson many African leaders are now internalizing. When policies carry no cost, they continue. When they do, they are reconsidered. The AES response stands out because it was coordinated. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger acted as a bloc, not as isolated states. That coordination changed the calculation. Retaliating against one country is easy. Facing a unified response is not. Contrast this with the reaction from larger states like Nigeria, which publicly argued that reciprocity would hurt its own citizens more than it would affect Washington. That argument reflects a long-standing fear that asserting sovereignty carries unbearable risk. The AES is testing that assumption, and it is not alone. Other African governments have begun applying the same logic in different contexts. Namibia reviewed its visa regime and concluded that one-sided access made no sense. If Namibians needed visas to enter certain countries, then those countries would now need visas to enter Namibia. This was not retaliation. It was alignment. Ghana responded firmly after its officials were subjected to unnecessary delays abroad, signaling that dignity is not negotiable. Senegal suspended cooperation on an extradition agreement when reciprocity broke down, reminding its partner that sovereignty runs both ways. These examples point to a broader shift, not in policy detail, but in mindset. For decades, African diplomacy was shaped by avoidance. Avoid escalation, avoid friction, avoid saying no. The cost of resistance was assumed to be higher than the cost of accommodation. The AES is challenging that calculation. Under the political influence of Ibrahim Traoré, the alliance is framing sovereignty not as a speech, but as a practice. Reciprocity is not framed as hostility. It is framed as equality. This distinction matters, especially for American audiences. Reciprocity is a principle deeply embedded in international relations. When applied by powerful states, it is called firmness. When applied by weaker ones, it is often framed as provocation. The AES response exposes that double standard. Another important dimension is access. The common narrative suggests Africans lose more when movement is restricted. That is only half the story. Western governments, corporations, and institutions also rely heavily on access to Africa for resources, investment, security cooperation, and influence. Africa is not isolated, it is central. When access becomes conditional in both directions, relationships become more balanced. That is what makes reciprocity uncomfortable for those accustomed to asymmetry. The significance of this moment lies not in the number of visas affected, but in the precedent it sets. If reciprocity becomes normal, then unilateral decisions will face immediate consequence. That changes behavior. This is why the AES response has drawn so much attention. It suggests that future restrictions will no longer be absorbed quietly. They will be measured, matched, and answered. For critics, this raises concerns about escalation. But escalation only occurs when one side is accustomed to acting without response. Equality introduces stability, not chaos. The deeper shift here is psychological. African governments are beginning to act as if sovereignty is non-negotiable, not conditional on approval, aid, or silence. This does not mean confrontation is inevitable. It means respect is being demanded, not requested. The role of Ibrahim Traoré in this context is symbolic and practical. He represents a generation of leadership less inclined to prioritize comfort over consequence. His influence within the AES has helped normalize decisive responses where hesitation once prevailed. Whether one agrees with every policy choice or not, the direction is clear. The era of automatic compliance is ending, and once that door closes, it rarely reopens. So this moment is about more than visas. It is about whether African sovereignty is treated as real or rhetorical, whether equality in international relations is practiced or postponed, and whether dignity is optional or foundational. The response from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger under the growing influence of Ibrahim Traoré did not break international norms. It applied them evenly. That is why it matters. If reciprocity becomes the standard rather than the exception, global actors will think twice before imposing one-sided decisions, not out of fear, but out of respect. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a recalibration. And the question going forward is simple. Will this moment remain isolated, or will it become the new normal? Thank you for watching.